I think you're going to remember today it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
In recent weeks, the world has been watching a new round of tensions in relations between the two largest economies on the planet, the European Union and the United States of America. It would seem that the era of globalization should have brought countries closer together, created single markets, and facilitated the exchange of goods and services. But today's reality shows that economic borders are once again beginning to strengthen. Under pressure from the US administration, particularly with the support of the America First policy, Washington has imposed tough tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Europe and is now threatening to expand the list of goods subject to duties. In response, the EU is preparing its own response, a package of tariffs of 25% on American goods, worth a total of around $100 billion. This is not just another economic reshuffle, it is a serious test for the very concept of free trade and global economic interdependence. But what lies behind these figures and statements? Why is this trade war resuming now? And what consequences could it have not only for Europe and the US, but for the whole world? Could we be on the brink of a new economic recession caused not only by the pandemic and inflation, but also by the ongoing struggle for trade influence? It is expected that the goods subject to new tariffs will include not only steel and aluminum, but also automobiles, electrical machinery, software, and even services related to digital technologies. This means that the struggle will go far beyond metallurgy and industry, affecting consumers, technology companies, and even the tourism sector.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Of particular concern is the impact of these measures on the aviation industry and global tourism, sectors that have only recently begun to recover from the crisis caused by the pandemic. Higher tariffs and rising airfares could lead to a sharp reduction in flights, affecting millions of people whose lives depend on international travel, whether for business, study, or leisure. In such a case, Europe and the US risk not only losing trust in each other, but also triggering a wave of economic turmoil that will affect airlines, tour operators, and even entire economies dependent on tourism.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Canada, a country closely linked to both sides of the conflict, has not remained on the sidelines. As a major trading partner of the US and a member of agreements with the EU, it could find itself caught between two fires, facing a reduction in tourist flows and a drop in service revenues. This is only part of the far-reaching consequences that could escalate into a global economic crisis if the parties fail to find a compromise. In this video, we will take a detailed look at how and why this tension arose, who will win and who will lose in this trade battle, and what unexpected consequences it may have for millions of people around the world. We will tell you how politicians, business people, and experts assess the current situation and what scenarios they consider most likely. Get ready to learn the whole truth about the coming trade war that could turn the global market upside down and change the familiar order of international relations.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
Stay with us to understand why the stakes are so high right now, and how ordinary people, from small travel agency owners to everyday passengers planning their next flight, will feel the consequences of this struggle. After all, this story is not just a battle over tariffs and duties, It is a game in which the future of the global economy is at stake. In recent months, the world has witnessed a new phase in the escalation of trade relations between the two largest economic blocs, the European Union and the United States of America. It all started with a sudden announcement by the US administration, led by then-President Donald Trump, that it would impose tough tariffs on metal imports, primarily steel and aluminum. This decision caused a storm in the global economic community and provoked a strong response from Europe. However, few could have imagined at the time that this would be only the first wave of a larger trade war that would affect dozens of industries and disrupt long-standing trade ties.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
Under the slogan America First, the US is seeking to protect its domestic markets and industry by increasing protectionist measures and restricting imports from abroad. In this context, tough tariffs on metal products have become not just an economic tool, but a symbol of a new era in international trade where competition is reaching new heights. The European Union has perceived these actions as a direct threat to its exporters and industry, prompting Brussels to prepare retaliatory measures designed not only to protect economic interests, but also to demonstrate its determination to stand up for its companies and workers. Sources in EU trade circles have already begun to report on the possible introduction of a package of tariffs worth around $100 billion in response to the US duties. Among the goods on which a 25% tariff is planned are not only metal and aluminum, but also cars including electric vehicles, as well as various technological products and digital services. This is not just a retaliatory measure, it is a signal to Washington that Europe is ready to use its entire arsenal of economic influence to defend its position. In the corridors of European institutions, discussions are focusing not only on the economic consequences, but also on the political risks. Such an escalation could lead to long-term damage to relations that were considered strategically important and stabilizing for the world order. Experts predict that these new tariffs will hit key sectors of the economy on both sides of the Atlantic. American automakers and technology giants will come under pressure, while European exporters will face a sharp drop in demand for their products. There are already reports that several large European car companies are considering moving part of their production from the US back to Europe, or to third countries to avoid the impact of tariffs. Such moves could lead to changes in global supply chains and increase costs, which will ultimately be passed on to consumers.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
The trade policies of both sides are becoming increasingly tough and uncompromising, further complicating the search for common solutions. While the US administration publicly declares the need to protect national interests and create jobs within the country, the European Union emphasizes mutual benefit and the preservation of open markets. However, behind these statements there is growing mistrust and suspicion that each side is prepared to take extreme measures to strengthen its influence. In closed diplomatic talks in Brussels, warnings are already being heard that a protracted trade war could lead to a deep recession, affecting not only the economies of Europe and the US, but also many countries linked to them by trade ties. Amidst the escalating tensions, lobbyists and business structures interested in minimizing damage are actively mobilizing. European companies are sending petitions to Brussels demanding a balanced approach, warning that large-scale tariffs could destroy the already difficult recovery from the pandemic. Similar efforts are underway in Washington, where representatives of large corporations are calling for dialogue and compromise, fearing that a hostile trade environment will undermine the investment climate and slow innovation.
with Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
However, time is against everyone. Information leaks and pressure from politicians in both capitals indicate that mutual accusations and retaliatory measures are becoming the norm. There is already talk in the EU that the Euro 100 billion tariff package is not only an economic move but also a diplomatic message aimed at showing the US that Europe is no longer prepared to stand aside, watch its interests being ignored. Unofficial sources in European trade commissions claim that the specific list of goods subject to additional tariffs will include segments that are critical to US industry, from passenger cars to modern software solutions for the digital economy. On the other side of the Atlantic, the reaction was not long in coming. The White House is considering imposing additional duties on European goods, including agricultural products, aviation equipment, and even certain types of tourist services. Such measures could lead to a chain reaction, where each new tariff becomes a reason for retaliation, turning trade relations into a battlefield where only those who know how to use economic power as a weapon will win. Some analysts are already saying that if the trade conflict escalates, trade between the EU and the US could drop by 15 to 20%, putting tens of thousands of jobs at risk and dealing a serious blow to both economies.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In the end, the first and second points of the plan show us that behind the numbers and statements lies a much deeper conflict, where economic interests, political ambitions, and national security issues are all mixed up. This new wave of trade tensions poses risks to global stability and requires leaders on both sides to strike a balance between protecting their markets and maintaining international cooperation. For now, the world is waiting with bated breath to see what decisions will be made in the coming months, knowing that the stakes in this game are extremely high and the consequences could be unpredictable. The tensions building between the European Union and the United States inevitably affect not only traditional trade sectors, but also areas that seemed less vulnerable to tariff wars. One of the most sensitive and responsive sectors has been tourism and aviation, industries already battered by the global crisis caused by the pandemic. International flights, tour operators, hotels, and other participants in the tourism chain now face the risk of a new wave of shocks that could not only slow down the recovery, but also trigger a serious economic downturn. Alarming trends are already evident. Airlines are being forced to raise ticket prices, which is affecting demand. An industry that has historically relied on the availability of international flights and tourist flows now faces the threat of a 20 to 30% decline in passenger traffic over the next 2 years. Routes between Europe and the US, which have traditionally been among the most popular and profitable, are particularly vulnerable. Experts note that higher airfares and related services could lead to fewer flights, especially on less busy routes. Some airlines are already discussing the possibility of withdrawing flights from unprofitable routes, which will inevitably affect budget travelers and residents of remote regions.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
The consequences for the tourism industry are particularly painful when you consider that Mediterranean countries such as Italy, Greece, France, and Spain are heavily dependent on American tourists during the summer season. Representatives of the tourism industry are already warning of a possible sharp decline in visitor numbers, which could lead to a drop in revenue, mass layoffs, and the closure of small and medium-sized businesses in the hospitality sector. Similar problems are looming for major U.S. cities such as New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, which are traditionally attractive destinations for European travelers. Rising airfares may force many tourists to cancel their travel plans, dealing a serious blow to the economy and employment in these regions. What is particularly worrying is that in such a situation, it is not only tourists and companies that suffer, but also related sectors, including aircraft manufacturing, insurance, logistics, and even retail trade in tourist centers. For example, analysts cite examples of disruptions that have already begun in the supply of aircraft components from Europe to the US and back, partly due to deteriorating trade conditions and rising tariff barriers. This situation creates a chain reaction that increases uncertainty and leads to delayed investment in aviation infrastructure and new technologies. Canada, a country with close economic ties to both the EU and the US, occupies a special place in this chain. Despite its relatively small population, tourism and services account for a significant share of the Canadian economy. Canada depends on tourist flows from Europe and the US, and the tightening of trade relations, leading to higher airfares, could seriously affect visitor numbers to popular Canadian resorts and cities. In addition, Canadian companies operating in the tourism sector are already experiencing difficulties in recruiting and retaining staff, and a potential decline in demand will only exacerbate the situation. At the same time, trade restrictions threaten to slow the growth of Canadian exports of goods and technology, particularly in the automotive and agricultural sectors, which are closely integrated with the US and European markets.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Canada's political leaders find themselves in an extremely difficult position, trying to balance the interests of their largest trading partners with the protection of their own economy. Calls are already being made in the Canadian Parliament for active diplomatic intervention and the search for solutions that will help avoid further complications. However, internal political conflicts, as well as the influence of the US on international agreements, create many obstacles to a quick and effective response. Thus, the third and fourth points of the plan reveal how deeply and comprehensively trade tensions affect modern international relations. The tourism and aviation industries, which have only recently begun to emerge from the crisis, are at risk of collapse. Increased tariffs and flight costs could not only reduce the number of trips, but also deal a blow to the economic development of entire regions and countries, including Canada, which finds itself in the crossfire. This creates a domino effect that could lead to a deterioration in many related areas, from manufacturing to services. If political leaders cannot find a compromise, the consequences of this conflict will be felt far beyond the economy and trade. The daily lives of millions of people could change. The decline in the availability of international travel will affect education, business, culture, and interpersonal ties, further exacerbating mistrust and divisions between continents. In such circumstances, open dialogue and a willingness to seek mutually acceptable solutions capable of preventing the breakdown of economic and social ties that have been built up over decades are particularly important. The internal, economic, and political realities of the European Union and the United States play a crucial role in shaping their trade policies and response strategies. The European Union is not a monolithic entity, but a complex and diverse union of states with very different economic structures and interests. Each country within the bloc has its own priorities, which can often differ significantly. Germany, Europe's largest economy, is heavily dependent on car exports to the US, and therefore any tightening of trade barriers by America is a direct blow to its industry and millions of jobs. France, in turn, focuses on agricultural exports, especially wine and cheese, and its farming and agricultural circles are expressing concern about possible tariffs that could make French products less competitive in the US market. Italy, on the other hand, relies on high-tech engineering and the fashion industry, which creates its own unique challenges and demands on trade relations. The potential consequences of an escalation of the conflict go far beyond the economy and trade. Many companies are already preparing for higher logistics and customs clearance costs, and the need to adapt to new rules, which will inevitably affect prices for end consumers. A decline in international trade and tourism could lead to job losses, lower government revenues, and slower economic growth. Small and medium-sized businesses, which do not always have the resources to respond quickly to changes in the external environment, are particularly vulnerable in this process. In the long term, the breakdown of trust and mutual commitments between the EU and the US could change the geopolitical map of the world, prompting countries to seek new trade and political alliances. There are already signs that some European countries are beginning to actively develop cooperation with Asian markets and strengthen regional integration projects in an effort to reduce their dependence on the US market. For its part, the US is also stepping up efforts to expand its economic ties in other parts of the world, including Latin America and Africa. In the end, points 5 and 6 of the plan show that the conflict between the EU and the US is way more than just a fight over tariffs. It's a complex mix of political, economic, and strategic factors that will shape the future of the global economy and international relations. It is important to understand that a trade war is a zero-sum game in which all sides ultimately lose. Therefore, maintaining channels of communication, a willingness to engage in dialogue, and a search for compromises remain key elements in preventing an economic crisis and ensuring global stability. For now, time is working against the negotiators, and the world is closely watching every new step in the diplomatic arena, aware that the stakes in this game are exceptionally high.